Sudana Speaks. This is the very first episode, and I wanted to dig into Genesis chapter 21. So basically in this moment, Genesis chapter 21 is where Isaac was born. Isaac was the promised son of Abraham and Sarah. So God said, I'm going to give you a child even in your old age. So they had to wait all this time for the son to get here, right? So I'm going to start at verse 21. Verse 1 of the 21st chapter. It says, Then the Lord did exactly what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and she gave a son to Abraham in his old age. So what God promised actually came to pass. But before this, while they were waiting for the promise to come to pass, Sarah had a brilliant idea in her head. And she said, well, you can have a baby with Hagar, which was one of their servants. Well, you can have a baby with her, and then we'll have the child that God promised us. So she tried to cause God's prophecy, God's promised word to come to pass in her own way. And then in verse 8, so after Isaac was born, they were having a party, a birthday party for Isaac or whatever. And Ishmael, which was the son that Abraham had with Hagar, which was his wife Sarah's idea. Verse 8, it says, As time went by and Isaac grew and was weaned, Abraham gave a big party to celebrate the happy occasion. Verse 9, But Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and her Egyptian servant Hagar making fun of Isaac. So she turned to Abraham and demanded, Get rid of this servant. So she told her husband, like, I can't take it. Get rid of this woman and her child, because this is not my child, even though you had this child with her. So she demanded that they leave, and she said, he is not going to share the family inheritance with my son Isaac. I won't have it. Verse 11, this upset Abraham because this was Abraham's son. But God told Abraham, do not be upset over the boy and your servant's wife. Your servant wife. Do just as Sarah says. So do what your wife is saying to keep peace with your wife. For Isaac is the son whom your descendants will be counted. But I will make a nation of the descendants of Hagar's son, because he also is your son. So, that was a consequence. The irritation from the woman was a consequence of Sarah trying to make God's will come to pass her own way. So verse 14 says, So Abraham got up early the next morning, prepared food for the journey, and strapped a container of water to Hagar's shoulders. He sent her away with her son, and he walked out into the wilderness of Beersheba, wandering aimlessly. When the water was gone, she left the boy in the shade of a bush. So Abraham walked her out into the wilderness with his son and said, go ahead. I gave them some food, some water, and it hurt him to do it, but he had to do it anyway. So at this point, she's wandering around in Beersheba. Then she went and sat down by herself about 100 yards away. I do not want to watch the boy die, she said, as she burst into tears. Then God heard the boy's cries, and the angel of God called to Hagar from the sky. Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries from the place where you laid him. So she thought she was forsaken. Sarah kicked her out where she was being taken care of, where she lived, because she was tired of seeing her and her son that she told her husband to have with Hagar. So she was tired of the teasing and the animosity between the two. So she told him to get out. And Hagar is feeling like, I can't provide for this child. This child is going to die. My child is going to die out here in the wilderness. So she went, laid the child down, and she went to cry out to God. So God sent an angel to speak to her at this moment and said that God has heard your cry. So then verse 18 says, Go to him and comfort him, for I will make a great nation from his descendants. So God was still, even though Sarah didn't like Hagar, God still was with Hagar and Ishmael. Even though Ishmael wasn't the promised child, God was still with them. Then it says in verse 19, so at this point, Hagar is wandering around the wilderness. She cannot find any water, any food for her child, and she's just thinking that they're both going to die. She doesn't want to see the child die. So she was desperate. Verse 19, it says, then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well. She immediately filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. So when it says in verse 19, then God opened her eyes, I stopped at that point because I'm like, her eyes were already open. So how did God open her eyes and her eyes were already open? So I looked into a couple of different versions of the Bible, and it basically said that God opened her eyes to see what was already there. So the thing about it is, she had eyes to see and her eyes were open, but she couldn't see what was already there because she was, in the wilderness, there are mirages and things that appear to be water until you get close up to them. Then you see that they're really not what you thought they were. So she was just pretty much weary at this moment. She couldn't see the provision that was already there. So God opened up her eyes to be able to see what already was in existence. He didn't create, it doesn't say that he created the water well, but he allowed her to see. He took the veil off of her eyes at that moment and allowed her to see what was already there for the provision for her and the child. And so in the NET version, it says, then God enabled Hagar to see a well of water. It didn't say that he created one. He just allowed her to see what was already there. So, it made me think, like, what are we allowing to hinder us from seeing what God is already doing in our lives, what God has already blessed us with, the provision that he's already made, what's already around us, that we have a roof over our head, clothes on our body, shoes on our feet. We have what we need around us, but sometimes we're so focused on what we had before or what other people have, we're not able to see what God is doing currently. And also in this text, I can see Sarah probably thought, okay, let's banish Hagar and the child into the wilderness. They'll die, they won't survive. But God was still with Hagar and Ishmael. Just because somebody doesn't like someone doesn't mean God is going to quit blessing them. And that's what people need to understand and get out of their mind. Just because you don't like a person, even with Joseph and his brothers, they sold him into slavery out of jealousy. But just because you hated him doesn't mean God was going to not bring to pass the dream that he spoke about. Doesn't mean God was going to stop blessing him because you didn't like this person. And that's something in the body of Christ that people need to get past. Because you don't like a person doesn't mean they're not anointed anymore. Doesn't mean they're not called by God anymore. And it doesn't mean that God is not going to bless these individuals that you don't like or that you don't understand. Because you can have a disagreement with someone and you choose not to forgive, but God is a forgiving God. And if that person went to God and asked for forgiveness and repented, then it's over. It doesn't matter if you want to hold on to it or if you want to hate somebody for life. It's not going to stop God from blessing that person. And that's something that everybody needs. Oh, you're going to get your karma. Okay, what about your karma? What about what you reap in the bad things that you've done? You want God to have mercy on you and to forgive you for things that you do, but then you don't want to forgive other people for the things that they do and have mercy on them. You want to hold them to that for the rest of their life just because of how you feel. But God is not moved based upon emotions. So just because you don't like a person or a person did you wrong, it doesn't ultimately mean that this person is just banished from God's eyesight and he hates this person. He's not going to do anything for this person. That's why the Bible says don't even seek revenge. Let God fight for you. Don't seek revenge. And also it says don't glory when you see your enemies reap what they have sown, the negative things that they sown. Don't let your heart become corrupted. You need to focus on forgiveness, love, and yourself, getting yourself into right alignment with God. And so just because you might feel a certain way about a person or a person feels a certain way about you, it doesn't mean that God is going to cut this person off from his provision, his blessings, his miracles, and things like that. God is still going to be God, and whatever he spoke over that person's life, he's still going to perform it. He doesn't change based off of circumstances and mistakes. A person can make a lot of terrible mistakes, and God can still be right there with that person. We all make mistakes, and God is still with us at the end of the day. And so there's two things here. God opened up Hagar's eyes to see what was already there that she didn't recognize because she was weary because of where she was, her location, and what she was going through. And then also Sarah thought that she could banish Hagar, and Hagar would be cut off from the provision of God, and she would just disappear and die somewhere. And God still sent an angel to speak to Hagar to give her information that she needed in order to survive. So God didn't go based off of the desire of Sarah's heart because she felt a certain way about Hagar. He went off of how I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts that are good and not of evil. And God will open up your eyes in those moments. We need God to open up our eyes in those moments when we're weary, when we're down, when we're emotional, when we're hurt, when we're in pain and things like that, because you will see through your wounds instead of seeing what God really wants you to see. And that's what Hagar was doing. She was looking through her wounds, and she was looking through her emotions and through her situation, her problem, and her circumstance, instead of looking unto the hills from which cometh her help. Looking unto God, she was focused on her situation, so she couldn't see clearly. Especially being in the wilderness, in the desert, you're seeing mirages, and you're thirsty, and your child is thirsty. He was probably crying. It was probably frustrating, irritating, and all of those things going on at one time. And so she was ready to give up, and she thought it was over, and then God sent an angel. So I would say, look around you and see what you're not seeing. Open up your eyes to see, and ask God to open up your eyes to see what's there but that you don't recognize.